Good morning, dear children. Dear children, in our previous class, we discussed about what is weather and what is climate. As I told you earlier, weather is a temporary phenomena and it is a state of the atmosphere for a particular day or time, or weather on a given day in a particular city. Sometimes it may be sunny, sometimes it may be cloudy, sometimes it may be rainy. So it changes every day. Weather changes every day. And I told you earlier about climate also. Yes, climate is the sum total of the place over a very long period of time. Yes, climate is the sum total of the weather at a place over a very long period of time. And weather of a place may keep changing. Weather of a place may keep changing. But climate of a place, it remains more or less the same for years and years. So this is the difference between weather and climate. And today we have the topic, what are the various factors that affect climate. Yes, what are the different factors that affect climate of a place. So dear children, there are the different factors. Number one is distance from the equator. Yes, that is the first factor, distance from the equator. And number two factor is, first is distance from the equator and number two is distance from the sea. Distance from the sea. And the last factor is, first is distance from the equator, second is distance from the sea, and the last factor is altitude or elevation, or we can say in another words, height of a place. Height of a place. So dear children, we will discuss about these various factors that affect climate of a place. Here is first factor, distance from the equator. Distance from the equator. So dear children, what do you mean by the equator? What is an equator? Yes, equator is an imaginary circle. Yes, it is an imaginary circle around Earth. Yes, it is an imaginary circle around the Earth, and equator divides the Earth into two parts. Yes, it divides the Earth into the two equal parts. Number one is the northern hemisphere and number two is southern hemisphere. Yes, it is an imaginary circle around the Earth. It is an imaginary line, we can say that, an imaginary circle around the Earth, and it divides the Earth into the two equal halves. Number one is the northern hemisphere and number two is the southern hemisphere. So distance, first here we have the first factor, distance from the equator. So dear children, what do you mean by this factor, distance from the equator? Yes, distance from the equator means places which are nearest the equator. Yes, the places which are very much near to the equator, they are hotter. Yes, the places which are near the equator, they are called hotter places, because one is the main reason behind this, the rays of the sun fall vertically on the equator. Yes, the rays of the sun fall vertically on the equator. So that's why it becomes hotter places which are near the equator. Yes, it depends upon the rays of the sun, because rays of the sun fall vertically on the equator. So it depends upon the distance from the equator. And The places which are very far away from the equator, or in other words we can say that as we move away from the equator towards the poles, the rays of the sun, it become slanting. Yes, as we move away from the equator, the rays of the sun become slanting and it spread over a larger area. So it means that heat is less concentrated. Yes, heat is less concentrated, so it is cooler. So dear children, this is distance from the equator. The places, in simple words we can also say that the places which are near the equator, they are hotter, and the places which are very far away from the equator, they are cooler. So it depends upon the distance from the equator. Okay. So number 2 factor is distance from the sea. Yes, distance from the sea. That is the number 2 factor, distance from the sea. And we can say that places near the sea. So dear children, places which are nearest the sea, and the sea has a moderating influencing on the influence on the region close to it. Compared to a land, water takes longer to the heat and cool, and thus oceans heat up and cool down slower than the land, and the cool sea breezes keeps the coastal areas very much cooler in summer and warmer in winter. Yes, cool sea breezes keeps the coastal areas very much cooler in summer and warmer in winter than places which are very far away from the sea. And in another words, and in simple words, we can also say that the places which are very near the sea, they have a very moderate climate. They have neither too hot, not very cold places. Okay, so this is called the distance from the sea, or places near the sea. The sea has a moderating influence on the region close to it. Compared to land, water takes longer to heat and cool, and thus oceans heat up and cool down slower than the land around them, and the cool sea breezes keeps the coastal areas very much cooler in summer and warmer in winter than places which are very far away from the sea. So dear children, our next factor is height of a place. Yes, climate affects also. Yes, it depends upon the altitude or elevation. Yes, it depends upon the altitude or elevation. Yes, altitude or elevation, and it depends also on the height of the place. Because what do you mean by altitude? Altitude means height. Yes, height of a place. The places at a higher altitude, they have a colder climate. Yes, places at a higher altitude have a very cold climate. And in other words, we can also say that we can take the example of any hill station like Ooty. Ooty is cool even in summer because of its height. Yes, we can take the example of any other hill station like Shimla, Ooty. Ooty is cool even in summer because of its height, and though it lies near the equator, and the peaks of the Himalayas are covered with snow even in the summers. And here you can see that peaks of the Himalayas, they are covered with snow. They are covered with snow even in the summers. So it depends upon the height of the place. Okay. So dear children, places at a higher altitude have colder climate than places at lower altitude. Okay. So these are the various factors which affects the climate of a place. Number 1, we have discussed distance from the equator. Places which are nearest the equator, they are hotter, and the places which are very far away from the equator, they are cooler. Next is distance from the sea. Places which are nearest the sea, they have a moderate climate. Yes, they have a moderate climate. And next is height of a place. Okay, it depends upon the height of a place also. And the places at a higher altitude. Places at a higher altitude have a colder climate, than places at lower altitude. Okay, so it depends upon the height of a place. So dear children, these are the various factors. First is distance from the equator, and distance from the equator, distance from the sea, and height of a place. These are the various factors which affect climate of a place.